Alright, I told you I'd have two stories for you, so here's another one. And that I'm going to talk a little bit about oil drilling in Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And you're saying, well, yeah, we already talked about that, man, during the Gwich'in and Athabascan unit. But now we're going to take it a little bit more from the perspective of Inupiaq communities, predominantly. And we're going to talk about specifically about one of our largest regional corporations, and also by far and away definitely most profitable, which is the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, or ASRC for short. And again, ANWR for the other acronym, that's the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So just to refresh your memory, that's an area that was put aside as a wildlife refuge. A large portion of it's wilderness land, but a portion of it is potentially open for oil if Congress decrees it so. Congress did recently decree it so, but that only came after sort of decades of fighting back and forth about it. And it's something that many Gwich'in people have opposed due to the effects that it could have on the porcupine herd of caribou, which is not a herd of porcupine, it's the name of a big caribou herd, one of our biggest caribou herds. But at the same time, it's one, as I kind of alluded to last time, that, there's some Inupiaq people that support this. And indeed, I want to now go into kind of that side of the story a little bit more. So you have ASRC, which is not only, to my understanding, not only Inupiaq shareholders, but a large percentage of that. It's these Inupiaq communities in the far north and Inupiaq shareholders. And it's, again, a very, very profitable Alaska Native corporation. A lot of the corporations produce kind of modest revenues, and therefore, if there is a dividend, if there is a check coming into shareholders, it's, on the smaller side, definitely. ASRC, by contrast, has $2.5 billion in revenue. And that was actually back in 2015, so I'm not sure with how the oil market's been going where that would stand now. But $2.5 billion revenue. Obviously, there's also a ton of operating expense. They have, a couple thousand employees at least. So I'm not suggesting that they have $2.5 billion in profit, but $2.5 billion in revenue, that's a lot of money that's sort of going through there and then, into income or into dividends or different things. Now, they've diversified over the years, and intentionally so. Initially, this was very much, in large part, their profitability driven by oil, because they have subsurface rights to, quite a bit of acreage across the North Slope. And so nowadays, they've diversified sort of what they're up to economically. And so ASRC now, though, it's still at least a quarter oil related. And I said over a quarter because it's something like 26% is directly oil related, and then 14% is, quote, energy related. And I think a lot of that is still sort of indirectly related to the oil fields and to servicing the oil pipelines. As this caption notes, this is from one of the ASRC's reports. They say they're the largest oil field services company in Alaska. So this is a huge company that's getting a lot of revenue from oil, obviously. And using that revenue, as they'll point out, for a number of different things for ASRC shareholders. It's not just sort of money, right? Money is used to fund a lot of different things, a lot of different programs. Things like, in the community we talked about a couple weeks ago, the Inupiaq community, things like good plumbing, things like really good firefighter patrol, right? Things like that. So ASRC then stands to benefit from oil extraction in ANWR, both in the sense that local Inupiaq communities would probably be involved on the employment side from the jobs, and also in the sense that part of, not all of, but part of the area that would be drilled would be part that ASRC has subsurface rights to, has oil rights to, so they would benefit also through royalties from the leasing. So this is one of those issues, right, where if you only talk to sort of outside groups, I was reading one article today that was by an outside group that was clearly opposed to oil drilling in the ANWR. And, that group, I would say I think they tried to sound unbiased in their article, but I'd say they definitely sort of had an axe to grind with ASRC, and with ASRC specifically because ASRC has, over the last several decades, lobbied Congress many times, sent lobbyists to DC to try to get ANWR opened up for oil exploration, again, because they would economically benefit from it. And so outsiders might see that as sort of what's going on there. And might have some sort of animosity to ASRC if they're opposed to oil drilling in ANWR. And, this kind of goes along with a trend that we sometimes see, those of us who study environmental issues with tribes, which is that there's sometimes this sort of desire from conservationist groups, whether in state or out of state, this kind of assumption that, well, of course, native groups are going to take our side because they depend on these lands and have these spiritual relationships since time immemorial with these lands. They're going to be our natural allies. That's what environmentalist groups sometimes kind of naturally assume. And although that assumption makes sense to some degree, at the same time, I think you have to understand that environmental issues are a lot more complicated than that, really with any community, and definitely with Alaska Native groups. We do have to consider things like subsistence, right? And so, yeah, definitely, when there's a concern for pollution, there's a concern that would affect subsistence. So that would cause, folks to not feel comfortable, maybe, with things like an oil pipeline, for example, going near their community. We also have to consider that there's sometimes sacred or culturally significant landscapes that people may not want to be harmed. At the same time, we have to consider current economic conditions and both political and legal constraints. As was brought up in the Roderick reading, the Alaska Native corporations are for-profit corporations, and they are in a sense legally obligated to turn a profit for their shareholders. Although I don't think this has ever been done, in theory, shareholders could take their own corporation sort of to court if the corporation was perceived as not trying to be a profitable corporation. So if an Alaska Native corporation was to say, we're not going to develop any of our lands, we're not going to do any economic activity, we're not going to invest any of our money, we're just going to let it all chill, that could actually be a legal liability for them, in which case that could be considered a liquidated asset, which would then turn over potentially to outside groups, to the state, something like that, which then means a loss of control of your land base as a whole. So that's a situation, some Alaska Native people argue, we kind of have to use it or lose it to some degree, and better that we use it and have a say in how it's used and make sure it's done in line with our values, rather than have sort of outside groups use it instead, rather than lose our economic control over these lands. That's a really unique sort of situation. That is not the way it works in the lower 48 with tribal lands, because that's the reservation system. That's a very uniquely sort of Alaskan both opportunity and limitation that corporations face as far as this sort of fiduciary obligation to turn a profit. That doesn't mean all lands need to be developed by any stretch of the imagination, but it sort of puts corporations into a situation where they feel that at least some of the lands need to be developed for a profit. And that can mean a lot of different things. Down here on the peninsula, that sometimes means sort of small-scale real estate developments, putting in an apartment complex kind of thing and renting it out. That can mean up on the North Slope, these big oil operations. That can mean down in the southeast area, maybe fishery operations, or a lot of different things that could be a way that a tribe tries to make money from its land. As Larry Merkulioff points out, who used to be the CEO of the Aleutian Island Corporation, they were able to make a lot of money through tourism, right? So it's not necessarily a straight up extractive use of their land. It does require a bit of an impact because you have to build, like an airstrip and a hotel, but for the most part, it's a non-impactive sort of use of the landscape. You just, bring people in and then cart them back out for tourism. But whether it's an extractive use or not, there's still sort of this need for a profit. So that's a political and legal context that needs to be understood. And it's not just this sort of corporations are worried about being sued or something. This is something that was pursued actively by the people that advocated for the passage of ANTH because it would allow for groups that had at the time been suffering from, for example, really bad life expectancy, really dire unemployment rates, allow them to turn a profit, and has now allowed some communities to have more, economic opportunity. And also, as one of the opinion writers in the Roderick book pointed out, allow them to invest in things like educational services, allow them to invest in things like museums to sort of honor and perpetuate the cultural traditions. So there's a lot of things going on there that have to be understood. So the decision to drill on a piece of land or not drill on a piece of land, the decision to mine on a piece of land or not mine on a piece of land, the decision to log or not log, the decision to use it for tourism or not use it for tourism, all of these are complicated, right? And there are also issues where there's going to be diversity within groups. I thought the Merkulioff reading did a good job of pointing out that you'll have, for example, shareholders that live far away from the lands who might say, well, we should do sort of what's most profitable for the group as a whole. And then folks that live really close to the lands that might have more of a perspective of like, I fish on those lands. So we need to make sure that, be really cautious with doing any development on the lands. And so there's a lot going on is what I'm trying to say. I'm not here trying to sort of argue some sort of drill baby drill argument here or something like that. I think it's really good to be cautious with how we do things environmentally, and I think a lot of our groups across the state, both Alaska Native and otherwise, do try to be cautious. And I myself tend to identify very much in sort of wanting for there to be, good, solid, strong environmental stewardship. All I'm suggesting here is that, these issues are complicated and tribes face a lot of complicated choices in terms of deciding how to use their land base. I now want to dive in a little bit to sort of the readings you did from the Roderick book, the smaller book, both this time and a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Inupiaq. So I said before, you have to consider subsistence. So on the one hand, Alaska Native corporations are required sort of legally to turn some kind of a profit, and presumably want to turn a profit so as to provide for their shareholders and do good things for their communities. At the same time, some of the ways in which profits are turned could potentially have, polluting or other kinds of impacts on the land, which that then sort of causes potential concerns about subsistence. And so, or not, depending on what the environmental project is and how well it was done. I've got several pictures here from our previous lectures, and you probably remember from our previous lectures how often subsistence came up, how often fishing and hunting and gathering came up. In so many ways, fishing and hunting and gathering are sort of this core around which entire cultural ways of life are built. And I think Alaska is somewhat unique to a lot of other parts of the United States in the sense of how much many of these subsistence lifeways still persist into the present day, even if they've had some modifications. So that's one part of the puzzle that Alaska Native communities have to ask themselves, and why maybe certain lands don't get developed or opened up, because it's sort of, this would have an effect on our subsistence, on our fishing and hunting that we don't want to see. So that's really different than sort of a normal for-profit corporation in the sense that they have a responsibility not just to turn a profit, but also to look out for the cultural welfare of their people. And that sometimes might mean saying this piece of land is worth too much for us as hunting ground or fishing ground or spiritual ground, and we're not going to open it up. I like this quote from the Roderick book. Subsistence is the term most often used to describe a way of life that Alaska's native people have lived for thousands of years, and the way all cultures lived prior to the development of agriculture. It is a way of life in which everything, the economy, people's relationships to one another, philosophies, spirituality, science, technology, healthcare, artistic expression, education, jokes, ideas about gender and sexuality, entertainment, the creation of tools, shelter, and clothing, is intimately tied to the land and the waters upon which the people depend for sustenance. I also liked this quote. The subsistence activities, hunting, both land and sea mammals, fishing, berry picking, and harvesting wild plants and shellfish not only allow Alaska Native families to feed and clothe their families, but also provide the center for their entire lives and communities. So as we, I think, saw over the last several modules, it's not just a matter of sort of putting food on the table, but also sort of a centerpiece of how things are thought of spiritually. And as we'll talk about next week, that just because groups have often sort of converted over to Christianity, much of those spiritual connections to the landscape are still very much there, and a part of what, cultures have to, or part of what Native communities have to think about is how a project's going to affect their relationship with the landscape. Or if we're talking about projects done by outsiders, such as opposing the Pebble Mine, part of the consideration there is sort of, how is this mine going to affect a resource that we use, not just for food, but spiritually? I really liked the reading by Roderick, do some Native, I think the titling of it was Do Some Native Corporations Support Oil and Drilling or something like that. They had the perspectives of 3 different Alaska Native authors, all of them prominent people in the state who took kind of very different positions, and I like that because it shows how diverse it can be between different Native communities and even within Native communities. So let's kind of talk briefly about the 3 of them. Paul Ongtuguk, who's an Inupiaq man, also professor, and also it sounds like for a time was prominently involved in the Katsiubi tribe. He says, yes, some Alaska Native corporations do support mining, some support logging, others support drilling for natural gas and oil. And he points out, that gets, when you answer it like that, that's just reality. But he says, a lot of times when people are asking about that, they come from a place where they don't think there should be a lot of development. He says, acknowledging that these activities occur is not a blank check of support for any and all activities, but a consideration of this kind of development. So I think he kind of takes a middle ground approach, kind of suggesting, these activities definitely occur and are supported and to some degree should occur, but at the same time, there's definitely instances in which they shouldn't occur, in which our communities feel like they shouldn't occur. It depends on the project. He also said, whatever your position is about economic development on ANCSA lands, please keep in mind that unless you're an Alaska Native, you're talking about our last lands, not yours. So he kind of makes a point to point out that when ANCSA went through, essentially Alaska Native lands were limited to 10% of the states, whereas, sort of pre-colonialism, it was 100% of the state. So people are operating in a context in which they've lost a lot of their land. I do want to kind of put a slight caveat to that, at the risk of being sort of overly bold and, settler-splaining this or something. I do kind of want to push back just a little bit about one statement that was made. He was saying, Paul was saying that there is, that twice as much land went to conservation during ANCSA as went to tribal usage. That is true, but we should also clarify what we mean by conservation for folks that maybe aren't as familiar as he would be. So allow me to clarify that just because a land is federal or state protected land doesn't mean it's not open to things like oil or mining or hunting, certainly, or logging. A lot of lands in Alaska are under federal or state ownership, but are allowed to be used in those ways. So, for example, a lot of the national forest lands, things like national parks are typically pretty sort of, you're not allowed to extract in there typically, but things like the national forest lands, or sometimes sort of other kinds of lands as well, you can definitely do certain kinds of extractive uses on them. However, the process to do it is more complicated because you have to comply with the federal laws. So just to say that, when people are like, 67% of Alaska is in federal hands, it doesn't mean that 67% of it is locked up against all business. That's not really how that works with public lands. A lot of it is still, quote unquote, open for business. Just business kind of has to follow a different set of rules. Anyways, I'm sort of getting off topic here because I find land law really interesting. Dr. Ongtuguk kind of is emphasizing the idea of resource use that should be done responsible. As he points out, so long as all of us are living industrial lifestyles, there needs to be a certain amount of resource extraction. And, I think he's kind of taking the point of view of why should Alaska Native communities not benefit from that, especially if we need that, and these are sort of our last lands, and, so we be kind of considering what economically and environmentally happens with our last lands. At the same time, he kind of takes an interesting position in saying that, maybe this shouldn't be just up to the corporations, but instead the tribal governments, which we also have in Alaska. Groups like the Kanaitsi tribe here on the peninsula would be one example. He's kind of saying, maybe tribal governments or tribal consortiums, sort of like the one we talked about with Bristol Bay, maybe they should have more power, because you sort of run into a hard situation if you only have sort of the for-profit corporations that are kind of making decisions for the Alaska Native communities' lands, especially when so many Alaska Native people today were born after 1971. And so for a lot of the corporations, that means they're not shareholders. So he's saying, this is potentially not a great situation, and we need to rethink sort of how we make sure that tribes and indigenous folk have a say with their land. Larry Merkuliev, you've listened to a talk by him before. He's Unangan. He was formerly the CEO of Tanagushik Corporation and also formerly the chairman of the Aleut Corporation, which, big deal. He's also a famous writer and speaker. He takes, I'm going to call it a slightly more I don't want to call it an anti-development perspective, because during his political positions, he was very much advocating for things like his corporation getting involved in like the tourism industry, or his corporation running a multi-million-dollar fishery. So it's not so much anti-development, but I would say he takes a much more cautious approach than the authors, and also one that's sort of skeptical of the corporate model. He says, I believe there's one significant area in which the ANCSA corporate structure and profit mandate is completely inappropriate, at least in its present form, and that is as it applies to use and development of traditional use lands selected by regional corporations. And he kind of suggests that there's like an inherent contradiction here in the sense that the ANTH corporations are mandated by law to look out for the cultural well-being and health well-being of their communities, who very often depend on things like traditional fishing and hunting activities and also spiritual connections to the land. But at the same time, they're also legally obligated to turn a profit. And those things sometimes are in tension with each other, right? The best way to turn a profit might be to develop land, and the best way to preserve traditional hunting, fishing, and spiritual use might be to sort of say this land ain't getting developed. So as he says, it kind of puts corporations into a really weird bind. And he suggests that this isn't ideal and we kind of need to rethink how we do things. So he says, part of his suggestion is we really need to be thinking about diversifying what Alaska Native, and he's saying we, by which I mean Alaska Native communities. He's saying, as Alaska Native communities, we really need to sort of rethink what it means to be profitable, and that has to include cultural well-being, and we should be looking into things that don't sort of have a deleterious impact on cultural well-being. So he shares a lot of examples of sort of things that worked in the village he was working at, and also things that he sees as potential growth areas like telework, call centers, different kinds of things that could be done from a distance. A third perspective is Margie Brown, who's Yupik and also the president and CEO, at least at the time of writing, of Cook Inlet Regional Incorporated, which is the for-profit corporation that services the Anchorage area, so one that you're probably familiar with. And she presents what I'm going to call kind of a very pro-development perspective, which doesn't mean she approves all development, but definitely pro-development and also pro the corporate model. And she says, capitalism embedded in ANCSA through the for-profit Alaska Native corporations offers self-determination, right? Like sovereignty to Alaska Native people who wanted that, who self-determination and a model wanted and got a model of sustainability. And those who would suggest that ANCSA was wrong-headed, I feel like she's kind of responding to Larry Merkulioff here, or somehow not in tune with traditional indigenous values, are making generalized statements without evidence. Sorry, there's a few typos in this quote. I think she's kind of suggesting, ANCSA was a really good thing. It wasn't perfect. Nothing kind of is. We did the best we could. If we'd waited longer, we wouldn't have even had a Land Claim Settlement Act. And, she says overall the program's working well and we're using it to pump money towards important programs for our people. And so, three very different perspectives. One quite skeptical of kind of the way things are currently done by the corporations and some of the tensions there. One, I think, pretty unabashedly for the way that corporations are managing lands and the way that some of the corporations do things like mining or forestry. And then one that kind of takes a middle of the road approach and kind of says, this has some good things. There's also some concerns, but it should really be up to the Alaska Native community. But also, what do we mean by Alaska Native community? Who gets a say in how? Three very different perspectives. And so I hope we get a few different conclusions from that reading. Number one, there's a lot more positions you can take when you're talking about environmental issues in our state affecting Native people. There's a lot more positions than just sort of don't use anything or use everything, right? There's a lot of other kind of positions along that spectrum. Different Alaska Native groups take different approaches, right? Contrast what Larry Merkulioff's group was doing versus what ASRC is doing, right? Really different ways of approaching turning a profit. Even within groups, individuals might differ, in part based on things like, rural versus urban Alaska Native shareholders might have really different needs. Subsistence needs are needs. There are communities where this is still a major part of people's lifestyle and will be so into the foreseeable future so long as the land allows it. At the same time, economic needs are also needs, right? People need jobs, people need an income. So these situations are complicated and complex. And I think we kind of run into an issue then where we have to acknowledge that respecting nature within, I think for a lot of Alaska Native people, doesn't mean never using it. It does mean using it respectfully, but the devil's in the details, sort of what actions are considered respectful and which aren't, and that's sort of an ongoing discussion. And that's kind of a situation in which some, you could even have one community that looks at a certain activity like some oil development. It's like, hey, this is a really good thing, and something else like a huge gold mine in Bristol Bay fishery and say, that doesn't sound good at all. So this all, by the way, kind of leads to a second perspective which I wanted to share, which is landscapes of injustice. It's a term used by Noriko Ishiyama, who's a geography professor. blanking on the state, on the university, I think it's Rutgers. And Dr. Ishiyama uses the term landscapes of injustice when she's talking about a native group in Utah, but the suggestion there is, Dr. Ishiyama says, I argue that a prolonged process of historical colonialism has produced a landscape of injustice in which tribes' choices have been structurally limited. To kind of put that in normal person speak, rather than academic speak, when a group is geographically and economically isolated, as some native communities are, and when a lot of the land base and wildlife that used to be used for the traditional kind of economy has been reduced, and then you add in that there's modern needs and demands, right? People in 2020 want to have indoor plumbing and electricity and things like that, and an income and a job. You add all those things together, you're in an economic tight spot where you're going to have to face some trade-offs and make some difficult decisions. Okay. Thank you so much.